everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Lightest and Best, where we look at the lightest and best offerings a variety of knife manufacturers possess. Today, we're going to be looking at the Hinderer XM-18 3-inch blade. I have three here. I'm going to just be looking at the orange one to start with because it's the most colorful, and I like the slicer grind myself. Oh, what a beautiful blade. The XM-18 is considered by many knife collectors to be the Holy Grail of Knifedom, the sumo sacerdote de los cuchillos. It is the pinnacle of what a knife should be. Others are mentioned whenever you talk about a Grail knife. There's the Chris Reeve Sabenza, either the small or large, depending on your size preference, or the Strider knives, depending on your size preference. Of course, since I like light, small knives, I go with a PT. But the Hinderer is counted among one of the most important knives if you're a knife collector in knifedom. Others have tried to imitate it. There's the Kershaw Cryo that has a Hinderer design, the Zero Tolerance 0560, the 0561, both of which have 3 3/4 inch blades. This is a 3-inch blade. There's also the 0566. The 0566 has a 3 1/4 inch blade, and the Cryo has a 2 3/4 inch blade. They're smaller offerings, but the downside to those are that they use the assist opening and they went down to steel lock bar faces instead of the titanium lock bar faces like the 0560 and 0561. If you're going to get a Hinderer imitation, the one I recommend is the Zero Tolerance 0562. The 0562 is 3 1/2 inch blade and still has the titanium scales. As you can tell, it's very similar in Hinderer design. Both of these happen to have the slicer grind where it's narrow at the base and then broadens as you get toward the tip. And they have the signature Hinderer over travel stop to prevent over travel of your lock bar. I would choose the 0562 because it runs on bearings and it still has titanium without the safety assist. It just runs on bearings and is a pure flipper. So this is the one, if you're wanting to get a knockoff and only wanted to pay half the price of a Hinderer, get the Zero Tolerance 0562. But hey, we're not here to talk about Hinderer knockoffs. We're here to talk about the Hinderer itself. The blade length on the XM-18 3-inch, by definition, is 3 inches long. The handle is 4 1/8 inch and is made of a textured G10. It's also made in carbon fiber, copper, or a variety of other materials. The total knife length is 7 inches long, and the weight is 3 1/2 ounces. All of the knockoffs come out heavier. For example, the half track, which is also a Hinderer design. It's not a knockoff, it's a Hinderer. It's smaller, but instead of 3 1/2 ounces, it is 4.1 ounces. It has a blade that's a little shorter. It's a 1/4 inch shorter than the XM-18. And this is a very good knife, too. I'll be doing a review. It has a great action. But again, we're here to talk about the XM-18. On the Cryo, the blade is shorter, but it's still a little heavier. It's still over 4 ounces, and this is 3 1/2 ounces. Well, the blade on the XM-18 3-inch is made of S35 VN. It has a Rockwell hardness of 60 to 61. It has a variety of options. This orange one is the slicer grind. The green one that I have is a Sponto. The Sponto is a hybrid between a Tonto and a spear point and is an interesting blade design. And then the other one that I have is the Tonto, and it has an interesting swedge on top. Those are the Hinderers that I have. Also, I wanted to bring out that they also had a Skinner and a buoy-shaped blade, which I'll show pictures of in the corners there. The method of deployment of the XM-18 3-inch is a flipper or a thumb stud or thumb log. The flipper works just average for a flipper, and it's a design choice. They chose to use phosphobronze washers for the pivot rather than ball bearings, and so it's not going to flip as fast or as hard as other knives. The flipper tab is functional and has jimping on the top. For my preference, the jimping actually is a little bit sharp. It hurts your finger a little bit whenever you push down on it. The deployment angle is adequate. It's about 45 degrees, as you can tell. The knife can also be deployed by the thumb studs or thumb lugs. And we're talking about the lockup now. The opening lockup happens whenever the thumb lug interfaces with the titanium liners and scales. And so when it opens, it goes like that. As you can tell, there are semicircles to receive the thumb lugs there machined into the scales. And it has a very nice lockup. The closing lockup is different. As you can see, there is a sandwiched stainless steel pin between the two scales here, and the blade tang stops on that stainless steel stop spin. So opening lockup is on the handle scales, closing lockup is on that stainless steel pins. Not all manufacturers do it with this quality. For example, Medford will have a stainless steel or a titanium scale and then a G10 scale for their external lockup. And here I brought in the Medford Micropraetorium just to show you the design feature changes. On the Medford, on one, it locks externally against the lock bar. The Medford's different in that both closing and in opening, it goes against the lock bar. But I just want to point out that on one side of the scale, you have the titanium, which is rigid for the lock lugs. But on the other side, there's only G10, which is softer. And I think the design of Rick Hinderer's is superior. He has titanium, and then he at least has a titanium liner here so that it can have a nice solid lockup, and there's not going to be any blade wiggle over time. This is not a soft G10 that's going to soften with time. The pivot, as I've mentioned, is on phosphobron washers. And with Hinderer, you need a special spanner tool or the Hinderer tool to disassemble the knife because the bolt sticks out from it. I want to give you a design comparison with Strider's Baby Huey SJ-75. On this one, they have a similar pivot in that it's an oversized pivot, and I understand knife manufacturers wanting you to get more leverage on the outside of the pivot, but they have a sunken pivot so that you can use a flathead screwdriver or a dime on the Strider SJ-75 Baby Huey, whereas on the Hinderer you have to get a spanner bit or the Hinderer tool. So I think the Strider has a superior design on that aspect. The lock bar is really what makes a Hinderer, and since I have this configured to right-hand carry tip up, the clip covers the lock bar over travel stop, but this round circular copper colored thing, I don't know if you can see it there, I'll bring out the zero tolerance. This is a Hinderer design. It has this over travel stop so that whenever you're disengaging the blade, you can't move your lock bar beyond where it should go, so this secures that your blade lockup is just going to be perfect. And that's a Hinderer feature and a Hinderer design. I'm going to back up a little bit and compare the size of this to a variety of other knives. And the one that I've already shown you is the Zero Tolerance 0562. The 0562 is a little large. I'll bring in something smaller here. We have the Strider PT. You can tell it's a little smaller. We have a Shirogorov knife, which is a little longer in blade length, and the handle is a little shorter, I believe. We have the Spyderco Dragonfly, also a little smaller. We have its little brother, big brother, the Half Track, which is a little smaller, but as I've mentioned, is 0.6 ounces heavier. Here is the Spyderco Para 3, and the Para 3 is a little bit longer. And the Strider SJ-75 Baby Huey, and the blades are about the same length, and I think the handle on the Hinderer is a little bit longer, however. So, let's talk about the pocket clip on this now. It's a embedded titanium spring clip, right-handed tip up or tip down. One of the design elements that I appreciate about the XM-18 is that it provides a filler tab, so if you want to switch it, you unscrew these, and then you unscrew the filler tab, and then you move the clip over here, and then you replace the filler tab here so that the handle scale is completely smooth. And I think it provides a cool aesthetic on the lock bar side. It has this steampunk look with all the busyness. It has the externally cut out lock bar relief here. You have an interesting spring clip that has machining on the inside. You have the polished pivots of the hardware. You have this proprietary pivot here. And then you have the lock bar filler, and it gives it a steampunk aesthetic, I believe. The ergonomics on the knife are very good. You can get a very good four-finger grip with it, and there is also a forward choil. One of the things about the forward choil, as long as your hand is back and you're pressing against the flipper tab, you're safe with the forward choil. I just want to note that the forward choil, your finger is actually resting on the sharp part of the blade if you're to move your thumb up to do close work. Other knife makers have handled this situation differently. I'm going to talk about the Spyderco Dragonfly, the masters of forward choils. They have about a 1 millimeter elevation, so when you put your finger there, if you want to go forward and your finger slips forward, it has that elevation, so I can move my finger forward and it's still not on the blade. It's resting on this 1 millimeter elevation. That's a wonderful design feature. Strider also has a wonderful design for their forward finger choil. You can put it up there, but they have a separate sharpening choil so that your finger is not resting on the sharp part of the knife blade. And I'll contrast this again with the Hinderer. Whenever your finger's there, if you move forward, your finger is really laying on the sharp part of the blade, so you have to move your hand back and press it against that flipper so that it doesn't get cut. And heaven forbids if you do a stabbing motion, your finger would be at risk. I think that if they did it like Spyderco, that would be the best alternative, that they could move it forward and elevate it a little bit so that it provides some safety to your finger when it's in the finger choil position. So what are my impressions about the Hinderer XM-18 3-inch blade? Are there opportunities for improvement? Certainly. The pivot, they could have used a recessed bolt like the Strider Baby Huey to make it more accessible and easier to use without proprietary pivot or a spanner bit. And the flipper tab could use some softening of the jimping, in my opinion. However, there's guys that work outside with gloves that might appreciate that. And for those of us who don't like the sharpness of the jimping, you can get a file or a sharpening stone and just soften that a little bit so that it's easier on your finger. And the sharpening choil or thumb forward finger choil, if they would have done what Spyderco did, and they can still do it, you can make adjustments to your design and have a 1 millimeter elevation right before the blade, it would be more protective for your finger. But what do I like about the blade? A whole lot. I like Hinderer because they're an innovator in the knife industry. They invented the over-travel stop. Hinderer leads and the rest of the industry follows. And there are a variety of other over-travel stops that have been generated. Here's an example of an internal over-travel stop. It has a lock bar insert. As you can tell, there's an internal over-travel stop, which many knife manufacturers are using now. And then here is a Spyderco Southern over-travel stop. It's integrated into the pivot, but the same idea is there, that it prevents your lock bar from over-traveling and hyperextending, and it protects the geometry of the lock and the integrity of the lock. At 3.5 ounces, the Hinderer XM-18 3-inch is not the lightest knife in the industry, but it's solid and well built. And if you're like Monty Python and you're in search of the Holy Grail, you need to get a Hinderer XM-18 3-inch.